don't think I've met everyone here before today, but there's one thing that I am still 100% certain of. There is one thread that ties us all together. We are all storytellers. Now, we may do it in different ways. You may enact, you may sing, dance, play the djembe, write, or like me, use art to tell stories. But the truth is that stories are a very big part of our lives. You listen to me talk here, you'll go home, and if someone asks you how my talk was, I know each of you will have a unique story to tell. Of course, general premise will be the same. She came on stage, she looked stunning, no stage fright whatsoever. But really, as much as I'd like there to be this common general narrative of how fabulous my talk was, I know each of you will retell the same story in your unique way, all thanks to your own experiences. And this happens in any given situation. Take an accident, for example. If you've ever been in an accident or even seen one happen, especially in India, there's something really fascinating that happens right after. There are about 15 stories that are formed around that one event. Now, the first story is, let's call him affected party 1, directly involved in the accident. The second story, affected party 2, also directly involved. And each, of course, claiming it was the other's fault. We've all been there, right? Now, the remaining stories are divided between bystanders who've actually seen the accident take place and others who arrive after, listen to stories from the bystanders, and make up their own versions of the story. It's amazing to me, this natural ability all of us have to retell the same story in different ways, all thanks to different influences and conditioning. And this has been happening for centuries now, ever since our mythological epics. How many of you here are familiar with the epic, the Mahabharata? And how many of you know about Gandhari, the queen who blindfolded herself when she found out that her husband was blind and would never be king? Okay, also quite a lot. Great. Now, this was considered to be an act of sacrifice by the most loving and dutiful wife towards her husband. She wanted to share the debility and pain that he was going through. And that's probably why most people thought Gandhari looked somewhat like that. Now, I grew up listening to stories from the Mahabharata, and I believed it 100%. It's only when I was in my final year at design school that I was reintroduced to the epic. And I began looking at it differently. It was as if a whole new world of stories and narratives and characters opened up to me. I began to dig deeper into the characters I didn't know too much about. And to my surprise, that was actually the women in the epic. As I learned more about Gandhari, I was surprised to find that she actually came from the kingdom of Gandhar, which is considered present-day Afghanistan, and she came from a family quite similar to mine. Liberal, well-educated. I began unraveling a new way of looking at the same story. I began questioning Gandhari's motives behind her actions. Was it, in fact, the love of a dutiful wife? Or was it an act of silent rebellion? As I learned more about her, my picture of what Gandhari looks like began to change. And I started looking at her somewhat like this. As I learned more about her, I found out that there were other storytellers whose versions of this story were quite similar to the one I was crafting. They too believed that this was an act of defiance over loyalty. Finding out about her husband's blindness after the marriage was a huge injustice, and she wasn't about to let somebody else have that kind of control over her life. As I learned more about her, I started seeing Gandhari as this modern-day feminist who was wronged and who, despite her limitations, made her resentment known. As I learned more about Gandhari, I started to relate to her. Now, as artists and as storytellers, we are pretty much programmed to look beyond what we see. We try to unravel new ways of seeing the same thing, and then we share it to make others see it too. But this can only happen when you question existing representation and go beyond believing the notion of a single story. To quote what acclaimed writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said in her own TED Talk, she says, "The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete." With a new lens towards the same story, I began breaking down these stereotypes I had bought into. I started looking at the characters and I realized just how real, how human, and how flawed they were. They each had their ambitions, their desires, their passions, their flaws, like me. In fact, like all of us here today. And I began to question, why is it that they made certain choices? Could I perhaps relate to any of these characters? And why had I always known and believed only one version of their stories? Now, like the many stories we retell today, for centuries, mythological stories have been retold by people, carefully extracting what is relevant to their audience. So let me illustrate this with an example from the Mahabharata. Now, Arjun, the skilled warrior Pandava, wins the hand of Draupadi, wise, beautiful, powerful princess of Panchal, in marriage, and he brings her home to meet his mother Kunti. So as Arjun enters the house, he says, "Mother, look what I have brought." And Kunti, with her back facing Arjun, without turning around, says, "Well, whatever it is, make sure you share it with your brothers." Oops. Unknowingly, Kunti had changed the course of the entire story. And she was shocked to turn around and find Arjun standing there with Draupadi. Now, this is a popular version of the story. There's another equally popular version that claims that Kunti knew exactly what she was doing. This was a very calculated move by which she made sure Arjun would marry all 5 of her sons, Draupadi would marry all 5 of her sons, oops, and she would be the reason they would remain close as opposed to drive a wedge between them. Personally, I prefer the second version. It's a little bit more dramatic. So this means that these stories, like other stories, aren't frozen in time. They have always been updated, adapted, and modernized with changing times and changing storytellers. I realized the reason mythological stories are hitting a sort of a dead end today is because there's a huge gap in modern retellings of the story. We have complex scholarly texts on one hand and oversimplified children's books on the other. And although there have been more contemporary adaptations of the text, visually and contextually, it remains largely the same. Let me illustrate this as well. Here's what their commute to work looks like. These are their problems at work. Horrible bosses, tension, deadlines, nothing. This is their problem. These are their teachers. Their mode of communication, their therapists. Krishna was this like all-rounder sort of a guy. So it's kind of obvious why it's difficult to relate to these stories. I believe that for mythological stories to be retold from one generation to another, we first need to fill this gap. And the way to do that is to appeal to those obsessed with sharing stories, millennials. Now, I belong to this millennial generation, as we have been named, and we are often criticized for, well, most things that we do. Lazy, entitled, screen obsessed, the list goes on. But there's one really valuable thing we are doing a lot more than any generation before us. We are sharing an enormous number of stories. And stories not just for learning or for education, but actually for entertainment and to form real human connection. Take the example of memes. Now, what is a meme? A meme is a visual combined with a statement put together to form a short story. See, what's unique about it is its ability to make a connection with so many people. and millions of people around the world. And we all love sharing memes, right? This means that for mythological stories to be passed on, we need to actually make them relevant. Now, as a designer and as an artist, I come across new stories every day. Brands that approach people like me are constantly looking to evolve, to be attractive to the ever-changing audience. Every client wants something new, refreshing, unique. Now, this is frustrating for designers, but it's curious to understand why even seemingly established brands like Apple, Google, Facebook feel the need to undergo frequent rebranding and updating of strategies. Why is it so important for brands to keep reintegrating themselves into the minds of the audience? It's because of the sheer information overload we have today. There are thousands of websites, apps, and people working day and night just to get to know us better, to get our attention. Now, as millennials, we function as human scanners. We scroll through so much information every day that we've actually become really selective about what we give our complete attention to. I'm sure some of you have right now zoned out because I have spoken 6 factual sentences without a change in the visual. See, we even make fun of the repercussions of how much time we simply spend consuming information. I believe that today, for mythology to attract attention, it needs to do what it has always done: evolve. We need to rebrand the epic, revisualize the characters, and retell the story so that it is relevant to the world we live in today. And each of us possesses the unique ability to do so. Remember that one thread that ties us all together? We may use different mediums, tools, even languages, but ultimately we are all storytellers. I read a book called Yuganta, which talks about, it's a compilation of essays on different characters in the Mahabharata by renowned anthropologist Iravati Karve. And something she said really stayed with me. She says, old traditions and thoughts never become inapplicable to the new world, and modern day practices are never so new that they retain not a grain of the old. It is so important that we revisit these stories we've been told as kids, the stories that we have accepted and forgotten, the stories that we have labeled as outdated and dismissed. Because only when we form a personal connection to these stories will they endure the test of time. And imagine being able to relate to characters crafted 3,000 years ago. Draupadi, the wise, powerful, beautiful princess, was married off to 5 influential men. And she was dragged and molested in front of a court because her husband's bet and lost her in a game of dice. Imagine unpacking her inner turmoil at being reduced to a mere object in this patriarchal family. Kunti, as a teenager, was granted a boon to evoke any god of her liking, and that she would be blessed by a baby from him. Now, being the curious teenager she was, she decided to try this out. And sure enough, the sun god appeared, blessed her with a child, whom she eventually had to abandon with a heavy heart. It would be so interesting to understand how it was becoming a teenage mother, all because of her haste. Imagine Draupadi as one of the flag bearers for the Me Too and the Time's Up movements against sexual harassment. Imagine if we could take Kunti's story as a starting point to talk about importance of sex education amongst kids. Imagine if we could decode Gandhari's controversial decisions to talk about how women have always had to conform to others' expectations throughout their lives. Imagine using the notions embedded in our mythology to highlight the problems that have plagued us for centuries. And now imagine doing this in a way that's relatable. Imagine having open conversations about taboo subjects like sex and why they are always equated with being besharam, shameless. Imagine talking about how difficult it is being your authentic self without being labeled sanskar or bekar. Imagine finally getting down to understanding why people have always associated virginity with purity. Imagine using pop culture references, even Bollywood, as tools so my fellow millennials can better relate to these stories. I imagine using the notions, principles, and teachings embedded in our culture to actually inform modern day life. So the Gandhari in my mind looks like this. The one in yours may look like something else entirely. The possibilities here are endless. The important thing is to keep questioning, to keep sharing, and to keep this narrative alive. Steve Jobs once said that the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. The storyteller sets the vision, the values, and the agenda of an entire generation that is to come. There are so many rich and valuable teachings embedded in our mythology, and it's up to us as creators, as innovators, and change makers to absorb, to adapt, and to share these gems so that we can finally bridge the gap and make way for a new generation of storytellers. Thank you.